Hey, so you should have noticed that I posted Sprint A from Lesson 3 as part of today's activities. I'd like you to go ahead and do that sprint first, just on a separate piece of paper or whatever. You can pull it up on your computer screen and just write your answers out. And then I'll show you my answers and talk about how I got some of them, and then we'll just sort of summarize some of the things we've learned this week. Go ahead and use a calculator while you do that sprint, but see if you can do as many of them as possible without a calculator, though. We want to try to start getting used to maybe doing some of them in our head. All right, so go ahead and pause the video here and then unpause it when you're done with the sprint. All right, so you should be done with the sprint at this point. So I'm going to open up to my page that has the answers. So this is Sprint A. This should be the one that you have for today. I'm pretty sure all these are right. I did it super fast and I did them all in my head. So there could be a wrong one or two in there. If there is, you can leave a comment on the video or tell me in our Zoom session. Go and pause the video if you need more time to check your answers versus mine. But I'm going to start talking about how I got some of these. So any percent out of 100 is just going to be that number, because it literally means this much out of 100 is like it's sort of a redundant question almost. Now when we start getting to 10% of a number, that 10% is just 1/10. And so that is another way of saying divide the number by 10. And dividing a number by 10 is super easy because you just take the decimal point wherever it is and you move it over one space to the left. So on each of these ones that says 10% of a number, I just imagine that the decimal point is at the end of the number and I just moved it over one space. These are methods that I'm using to do all these in my head without having to punch a calculator, but if you need to rely on a calculator, that's fine. Hopefully you're just, you know that 10% is the same as 0.10 or just 0.1, and you multiply that by, I don't know, if I'm doing number 15, you would multiply that by 70. And you get 7, the same answer I did. I'm just trying to think of ways of, being able to do it without relying on the calculator. So when we get to here and it says 10% of 22, I'm just moving that decimal point over 1 and I get 2.2. And then I'm using that information to get the answers for all these other ones that have to do with 22. This is something that's going to become more important in the next few lessons, and I like to refer to this as the manageable chunk process or strategy, manageable chunk strategy we can call it. And the goal is to eventually be able to do almost all of these percent questions, well, at least when we're multiplying by a percent, in our heads. And the way we do it is we find a manageable chunk of a number to work with and then build whatever percent we need from that chunk. So what I mean by a manageable chunk is, well, finding 10% of 22 is not that hard because we just moved the decimal place over one spot and it's 2.2. Now we have this manageable chunk to work with. I know that every 10% of 22 is 2.2, and I can use that to build other percents. If I need 20% of 22, let me just go back to my manageable chunk. I know that every 10% is 2.2. So if I need 20%, that's just 2 of my chunk. So it must be 4.4. 30% of 22, well, I need 3 of my 10% chunk, right? So 3 2.2s gets me 6.6. 50% of 22, I could use my manageable chunk on that one, but at the same time, I just know that 50% is half. So half of 22 is 11. Okay, and so now we get into some tougher ones, right? It asks, well, what is 25% of 22? There's a couple different strategies you could do here. You could get 2 chunks of 10%, which would be 4.4, and then a chunk of 5%, which has to be half of our 10% chunk, right? If 10%, let's see, am I on the screen? No. If 10% equals 2.2, 2.2, then 5% has to be half of that, which would be 1.1. Sorry, that looks so ugly. And so now I've got like multiple manageable chunks to work with here. If I wanted to do 25%, I could say, okay, that's 2 chunks of 10%, which is 2.2 times 2.2, which is 4.4, right? But then I have to add my 5% chunk, which is an extra 1.1, and that gets me 5.5. If that sounded confusing to you right now, that's okay, because I'm just explaining it to you for the first time, but we do eventually want to get good at that. But honestly, this question is easier to just say, oh, I know that 50% of 22 is 11, and 25% is half of 50%, so this number needs to be half of 11, which is also 5.5. It's totally okay to be relying heavily on your calculator right now, but this sort of like proportional equivalent like ratio reasoning that I'm going through right now should be the goal for you. So continuing with this manageable chunk stuff, if I need to know 75% of 22, there's a lot of different ways I could get this. I could say, oh, I need 7 of my 10% chunk from here and 1 of my 5% chunk, and add all that up. Or you have this other chunk to work with now, right? We know what 25% of 5.5 is. And 75% just has to be 3 of those. So you could just do 3 times 5.5. Or you could say, well, I know what 50% is, that's 11. And I know what 25% is, that's 5.5. If I add those up, I should get 75%, right? Because 50 plus 25 is 75. So there's like all these different strategies you could be using to get these. But, you know, if you feel more comfortable with the calculator for right now, that's fine. Just know that I'm hoping that most of you are able to do this sort of process eventually. I want to talk about the last 3 where you had to do percents that are greater than 100. The way I do these is I say, okay, I need 120% of this number. I could just grab my calculator and go, okay, 120%, that's 1.2 times 40, should come out to 48. Yep. But if I want to get good at doing these without the calculator, then I think, okay, well, 100% of 40, that's just 40 in itself. So I know I got a 40. And then 20%, well, so a lot of people could do that in their head. Some people can't. But most people should be able to do what 10% of 40 is. 10% of 40 is 4. And 20% is 2 of those chunks. So I need a 40 plus a 10% chunk, which is 4, plus another 10% chunk, which is another 4, gets me 48. So if you're doing percents that are over 100, just start with the fact that the 100% is the number itself, right? So 100% of 50 is 50. And then just manageable chunk it from there. Oh, I need an extra 20%. Okay, well, 10% is 5. So I need an extra 5 and an extra 5. That's going to get me 60. All right. So that's about all the like main work I wanted to do in this lesson. Since it's a Friday, I figured let's just keep the video shorter than some of the other ones, and I want to give you more work time to maybe catch up on some things you haven't completed yet this week, whether that's the problem sets I've been posting in Google Classroom, or you want to put more time into ST Math, or the assignment on Freckle or Flocabulary, or whatever else I've been posting. You'll have more time to do that today because the video will be shorter. So I just want to, like, on this blank page over here, just write essentially what have we done this week, right? So we learned how to convert fractions to decimals to percents, and vice versa, right? We got to be able to go both directions. That's sort of like the first key to being proficient in Module 4. And we learned that percent itself, the word, means out of 100, or for every 100, or divided by 100. And then we started dealing with these different types of questions where there's the part, the whole, and the percent. And there's a couple different strategies to solving these. The main thing that the book wants you to remember right off the top is that the part equals the percent times the whole. And I know I'm not big on using an x to mean multiplication, but I don't know, I'm just going to go ahead and use it here. So that's multiplication x. Well, if you remember this formula here, which is essentially what you just did, 44 times in the sprint, right? They give you a percent and a whole, and you're trying to find a part, and you're just multiplying them. You can find the strategy for solving the other three questions from this using our algebra skills, right? So if we think of part as like a variable, right? And percent as a variable and whole as a variable, I can divide and multiply both sides of the equation by things and make new true equations that can work for other things. So this equation here, we could call this equation 1. And you would use equation 1 when you have the percent and the whole and you need to find the part. Now, if I divide both sides of this equation by percent, I would get equation 2. Part divided by percent equals whole. And so this would be a great equation to use for questions where they give you the part and the percent and you have to find the whole. You would just do the part divided by the percent. And I got equation 2 by starting with the one that the book gives us and then just dividing both sides by percent. So what happened here is I didn't really write it because I didn't want to mess up my notes here. But when I divide this side of the equation by percent, it cancels this percent out. They make a 1. But over on this side now, I have part divided by percent. And then lastly, I can make equation number 3, where I'm going to go back to equation 1, and I'm going to divide both sides by the whole. So this one, to make equation 2, I divided both sides by percent. This time I'm going to divide both sides by whole. And so what I get is part divided by whole equals percent. And so if you have a question where they're giving you the two numbers and they just want you to find what percent that is, just take the part and divide it by the whole. That's like if you have a quiz and it has like 15 points on it and you got 12 out of 15 and you want to know what grade you got, what your percent score was, you would do 12 divided by 15. That would come out to, I think, an 80%. And so your percent would be 80 on that one. So this is one strategy to answering those types of questions, but it relies on you sort of remembering this stuff. The other strategy is to just remember that is means equals, of means multiply, and wherever it says what means variable. And then when you get a question that asks you something like, what number is 27% of 80? Sorry that I keep going off the edge of the book there. Then you just take these three rules here and rewrite this word sentence as an algebraic equation. So where it says what number, I'll just make that my variable, is, that's equals 27%, that's 0.27, and then of means times 80. And then to answer this, I would just do 0.27 times 80 and get my x. So these are sort of like the two different ways of thinking or two different strategies of solving a lot of the types of questions we're going to keep doing as we work through Module 4. All right, that's it for today.